Hi there, I'm back for another episode on Pascal's China lens. And who's also going to be back very soon is China itself. What do I mean by that? Well, just yesterday I was asked by the Belgium-Chinese Chamber of Commerce to actually give the 5 reasons for us to keep China on our radar. And I believe that there's a number of reasons that now is the moment to look again at China. Now, one of the first reasons I gave to keep China on our radar has to do everything with the narratives. We're looking up to certain narratives which I believe are false. What do I mean by that? Well, more and more you've been hearing for the past years about a new world order that China wants to create, together with maybe Putin and Russia that wants to create a totally new order that is not the international or Western order that we're accustomed to. And this is a story about democracies from Washington, from the West, against autocracies. It's either you're with us or you're against us. And the whole story is more and more has been for the past many years to try to contain these autocracies. And specifically since the invasion in Ukraine, we've all been looking at autocracies as being all the same. And so this has created an environment where this new Cold War mentality is popping up again. Now, Biden at the G20, he said, I don't want a new Cold War, or I don't want a Cold War, and he even promised it to Xi Jinping. But the actions for the past year have spoken very differently. And so this is more and more about a bipolar world that is being created by the West. A bipolar world of democracies versus autocracies. Now, I believe this narrative is completely wrong. It's actually a false narrative. Because if you look at this picture, this is the map of all the Western countries in blue that have put economic sanctions on Russia for invading Ukraine. Now that's interesting to look at, but what's more interesting to look at is to see all the countries in grey that did not put economic sanctions on Russia. I mean, most of them, and this is 85% of the world's population, most of them do not support the war in Ukraine. But they don't put economic sanctions on Russia. Why not? Well, if it would be all autocracies, it would make sense from this democracy versus autocracies narrative. But they're not. Half of them are democracies and the other half are autocracies. The biggest democracy of the world, India, is in there. And Indonesia, a huge democracy. So what is this all about? And some of these countries actually have a lot of relationships with Russia. Other countries, not at all. If you think about Latin America, for example, less than 1% of their trade is actually with Russia. While they have more than 50% of their trade with the zone in blue, the Western world. So shouldn't they follow the Western world in sanctioning Russia then? And how about Vietnam or Singapore, for example, that could be considered autocracies, but become the best friend of Washington? So I don't believe this story of democracies versus autocracies that Washington really is talking about and that Europe is following very much. I believe it's really about the West and the Western rule order or order that we have created, international world order, and the rest of the world that doesn't want to have a Western world order, but actually is looking for a multipolar world. This is not about bipolar or unipolar world, but a world where there's multiple spheres of influences. China, India, many big countries could be part of that. And so they all want to have their own decisions. And so why is it that the rest of the world, I'm talking about all these countries in grey color, why do they want to go for a multipolar world? It's because they want to make their own choices. They want to be able to make their own choices, and they know better than anyone else as countries what it means from their post-colonial, from their colonial past. They know better than anyone else what it means to not be able to make their own choices or have to choose sides, pick sides. And so this is this bipolar world. You're either with us or against us. But the reality today is that the world is becoming multipolar. And you're seeing now that more and more countries, more and more powers actually start to believe in this new narrative, which has been going on for a while, but is starting to create shape right now. And this is why if you believe the future of the world is multipolar, I believe you need to keep China on your radar, because China will be a central engine of this growth and creation of this new multipolar world with multiple spheres of influences. Now, the second reason that I think we need to keep China on our radar has to do with the illusions that we have very often when it comes to China. Basically, is the lens, the glasses we put on to look at China. And so is China going up or is China going down? Depending how we look at it, it's a binary decision or answer that we're giving on that question. And so I think there's more to it. And these illusions should not be the reason to decide how to look at China. If you look at this picture was taken just at the end of the 20th Party Congress, and what you see is these are the 7 most powerful people in China, the standing committee of the Politburo. And the last weeks after the Party Congress was over, I've asked about 1,000 people in Europe during my keynotes to raise their hand if they believe that this picture is a symbol and shows that China will be better or worse. And so I can tell you, almost 99% of the people in the audience said China will be worse. China's going down. This picture shows control. This picture shows actually that China is not going to evolve in a positive direction. It's all about control. And this means that we have a very different view on the world than Chinese themselves have. Because if you show this same picture to Chinese, what they see is strength. Many of them see that this is a leadership that is ready, an agreement that wants to work together to actually form China for the better. And so how is it that 1 billion people in the West probably think this is about control and China as isolating and going back into history, basically not going forward? Well, 1 billion people in China probably think the complete opposite. This same picture has an emotional connection that is 180 degrees different one from the other. And I think this is the problem. Now, I see that the negative perception towards China over the past 5 years has really increased incredibly, specifically since the Trump era. Today, almost 80% of all the citizens in Western countries, the countries in blue if you remember, are actually having a pretty negative perception of China and don't really trust China. And so how is it that this really exploded, went exponential almost over the past 5 years? Because if you look at the change that China had and the differences and the actual reforms and development that China had before these 5 years, what you see is that China had lots of change. China has constantly adapted towards its future. And China had lots of crises. And so if you think about it, in the last 25 years, there was the Asian financial crisis in 1997. There was SARS in 2003. Of course, in 2008, we have the international financial crisis. 2015, we had a stock exchange or market crash. And then, of course, we all had the COVID-19 crisis in 2020. So for the last 25 years, every 5 years, China had had a crisis. And every 5 years, China changed its policy, started to do different things, actually to cope with that future that was uncertain. And so I believe that the last 5 years, China did not change more than the previous 40 years. I mean, maybe it's in a different direction, but I believe change has been constant. The only constant in China is change. Now, what has changed, in my view, is the fact that Xi Jinping and the new government in the past 5 years has put China on the map, the global map. What that means is that suddenly China is on our radar. And so the change that China has had for 45 years was suddenly visible. And the other thing is that the path that China has taken, suddenly we feel this is not the path we want China to take. We would like China to take the same path as we are taking in the West. And so this is not about China changing or the regime being more tough or actually there being much more control only. It's mostly that we don't like the direction that China is taking with the new policies that they're implementing. And so we're looking at this again from, is it control or is it strength? And I think the problem here is this binary mindset we often have when it comes to China. And when you look at Chinese themselves, and most of the Asian countries actually, they have a much more and rather than or mindset. It means it's not per se one or the other. It can be both. China can go up and down at the same time. And one doesn't affect the other one per se. This is what you could call a qubit mindset. I made another video about qubit mindset many months ago, and this really shows that you have to look at the world at both possibilities happening at the same time. But we seldom do that when it comes to China. In Asia they do that a lot more. It's not just China. They really understand that this N thinking, A and D thinking, actually gives them more opportunity towards a better future. Now if you take that picture again of these 7 most powerful people in China, what you see is that next to Xi Jinping is his right hand, Qiang, who's actually going to be the premier of China in March next year. And he is, or actually was for 5 years, since 2017, the party chief in Shanghai. And so he will follow Xi Jinping, is what you hear in the media. Actually, what you hear in the Western media is that he is very loyal to Xi Jinping. He's worked with him, for him. Basically, he has to thank his career and his position today, and even as party chief in Shanghai, to Xi Jinping. We've also saw the lockdowns in Shanghai, very tough lockdowns. So our Western media, most of it was talking about this is an ally of Xi Jinping, where ideology is going to be more important than the economy. It's where they need to have policy and reforms in order to keep the power of the party. Now that's the story we hear constantly in the West. But then if you look at Qiang himself, maybe there's another story as well to look at. Why was it that Shanghai was under such a strong lockdown for 2 months? Well, partially it was because he wanted to keep it open as long as possible, because he wanted this expat and international community to not be affected as soon as needed. And that was, of course, maybe a mistake in the beginning, but still, being the number 2 in China now, I mean, it means that his mistake wasn't that big. What he also did is he invited people like Elon Musk to open a gigafactory in Shanghai, which was built in 10 months' time. Nowhere else in the world were they able to do it. He attracted a lot of foreign direct investment, more than any city in China. He made Shanghai the city of fintech in the world, and now going into the city of AI, the city of metaverse, maybe even the city of chip building or microchip building. So this is all about opening up and reaching out to the rest of the world. And this is very clear. This is why Shanghai became the main international city, thriving with foreigners. Of course, since the lockdowns, a big different story. But Qiang really was responsible for this opening up and reaching out to the rest of the world. So here's the question. Is he going to close down China, because he is going to be responsible for everything domestic, internal, as the premier of China? Or is he going to open it up? And maybe it's just both. And that is difficult for us to understand. But as long as we look at China as black and white, ones and zeros, binary, I mean, we don't see the colorful change that is constantly happening. And there's moments that actually things change and moments that things don't change. But at the same time, it's constantly in movement. If we look at China just from the dark side of China, like most of us do, well, then we don't need a radar on China at all. But I believe those who look at China as a colorful place with constant change and improvements, they will actually benefit from the opportunities of the opening up. Now, the third reason why I believe we need to keep China on our radar and why China will be back has everything to do with the winter ahead. And the reality is we're in a global crisis everywhere in the world. If you think about it, I mean, we just had COVID-19, the pandemic, almost over in many countries, or at least we're living with it. There's a war in Ukraine, which has created an energy crisis, created inflation. It's going to create recession. I mean, many problems, lots of tensions everywhere. And it also is actually creating a food crisis, which is going to be a disaster for the Southern Hemisphere. And these are just few of these crises, but it seems that one crisis isn't over yet, or we already are having a new one. This is the unpredictable world we're all talking about. And China's quite used in this unpredictable world. But the reality is, globally we're in a winter, and we're going to probably be in a winter for the whole decade. But China also realizes this. Not only do they have external, but also internal troubles. If you think about it, the real estate problems, if you think about the pollution, that they need to cap the CO2 emissions by 2060, I mean, a huge endeavor that they have to go through. If you think about the economy being hit because of COVID lockdown or dynamic COVID policies, demographic problems for the future, productivity issues, think about the debt of China, the state-owned enterprise. I mean, there's so many problems in China, and they have to cope with all of these. This is a winter that they're really feeling for a couple of years already really hard. But then there's on top of that, there's the international and global tensions. I mean, the demand is slowing, so exports will be affected. Many companies are thinking of decoupling or localizing to other countries in Asia, or maybe reshoring back to their own home country or closer by. You're seeing military tensions, and of course you're seeing this chip war and technology war, where it's really almost about sanctions, which is called a ban, but it's really just sanctions against China. So this all shows that China and the world, both of us, are going for and are in the midst of a harsh winter. Now, I think one of the differences between China and the rest of the world, the Western world, with this winter, is that China is trying to tackle these problems head on. What we see in this picture again is that this picture, for most Chinese, shows stability and security. And so economy is important, but if you don't have stability and security first, I mean, you might not have an economy. And so if China would be a company, not a country, then we would all be applauding the fact that the board of directors, these 7 people, actually are trying to focus on surviving and navigating that global winter that they're in the middle of, and try to figure out how to get out of that winter. And so that would be a good thing. But the fact that we feel that these 7 people were not elected in the democratic way that they would be in countries in Western Europe or in the West or in America and so on, we feel that this is not going to benefit China. But looking at it from the need for stability and security, I think maybe this picture shows that this is the right leadership at the right time. Now, what we have seen over the past 3 years, in my view, is that China, while we weren't watching, was starting to really clean up its house. And so we got a lot of information that made us feel like China's cracking down on things and is pushing back into egalitarian regime and whatever. But the reality is that they were behind the curve in many aspects and needed to correct that to actually clean up their house for the future. Because after that harsh winter, which is a slippery slope going down, and China needs to figure out how to actually navigate that, they can actually predict afterwards they're going to be a great spring. And spring in China always comes before the spring in the West. That's just a fact. Chinese New Year festival always comes earlier than when we are celebrating our spring in the rest of the world, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. And so what you see, in my view, is that China will be out of this winter before the rest or the Western world will be out of theirs. And so that's also a reason to look at China, because China ultimately is cyclical. What that means is that there's moments of lots of control, and then there's moments of letting go. There's moments of lots of tensions, and there's moments where everything is relaxed. And what I've experienced 20 years living in China is that these moments where control are let go, just like we're starting to see with the new regulation on COVID-19, and we're starting to see with the real estate that gets supported and so on, when this happens, what you see is that actually innovation, creation and new ideas are popping up, and a new China is popping up. And the visit at the G20 in Bali that Xi Jinping did was very clear, reaching out to that world to actually prepare for that next spring. And this is why I believe China will be back. It's just a cycle, but the trend is always upgoing. Now, the fourth reason to keep China on our radar has everything to do with the hidden gems. We're not looking anymore for 3 years because it was closed off. We're not looking at what's happening behind the scenes and what's really happening in China that could actually make it a spring. If you think about it, today we're looking so much at the facts and the details that we don't see the forest for the trees anymore. We don't see the big picture anymore. We're only looking at this visible. And the storyline that we have, you could call it a narrative, is always about the visible. It's about the major infrastructure investment that China did over the past 40 years, specifically the last 30 years, where you could see that they just made China a miracle in building cities and building high-speed trains and building, even outside China, the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, they're transforming the world into the visible world from an infrastructure point of view. And we believe that now that the economy's growth is going down, actually, it's the end of the tunnel. We don't see the end of the story anymore. We don't see the end of the tracks anymore. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. This is how we're looking at China. But what we're forgetting to do is to watch the invisible. Because the big transformation China is undergoing right now has less to do with the visible infrastructure and more with the digital and the invisible infrastructure. This has to do with smart cities that they're building, mega cities and clusters of cities of 100 million people that are becoming all digital integrated, whether it's in healthcare or whether it's in civil services or in retail, or everything is starting to get integrated. On top of that, what you see is that logistics is becoming way ahead of the rest of the world, specifically with technologies like blockchain, AI, IoT. Everything is going fast, more accessible, easy to use, and basically a lot cheaper to do trade with China. So for traders of the world, this is becoming really beneficial. What we also see is that China, who has become the factory of the world, is now wanting to become the green factory of the world. And they're really starting not to only make their companies and factories green, but producing the green products that could make the world more green. And so we don't believe much of this, but if you look at all the products we're buying, even in Europe or in Belgium where I'm from, whether it's solar panels or it's heat pumps or whatever it is, electrical vehicles, I mean, they're all coming from China, many of them at least. And so if you look at the future, it could be that we're only going to reach our global goals of emissions in Europe if we buy the products from China. And they know that very well. On top of that, China is creating a new finance model, which is a little bit scary when you're actually in the dollar world that we all live in. Because somehow, over time, it could really challenge the dollar, specifically on trade with the smart logistics that makes it so much easier and faster. So specifically the Southern Hemisphere is going to integrate in a new finance model that will need much less of the West than it needed it so far. And so all these things are not visible things, but they're disrupting the whole industry globally because China is taking a lead in making it happen. And so in my view, China is already 5 years ahead in most of these 4 aspects. And we will have to catch up if we want to. This is the reality and the reason. If we want to understand our future, we need to look at China's today to understand where this is going, and so we need to keep China on our radar. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the unexpected. Because we're always talking about things that we expect. We're forecasting China will this, China will that, China will that. But there's a lot of unexpected that will happen as well. The problem is that so far, we've always thought about China as being a bubble that is about to pop. It's a bubble that will burst. I've been watching China for 35 years almost, and over these 35 years, every year there's a magazine somewhere in the US or in Europe that will write that next year will be the year that the Chinese bubble will pop. But so far it has never popped. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, why did this bubble never pop? Of course, the last 3 years, China created a bubble of its own with the COVID policies. So it's normal that if you become a bubble or you want to be a bubble, that people will expect that the bubble will pop. But the reality is what we're missing in that story. And the reason China's bubble is not popping is because we're not looking under or below the waterline. We're always looking at the visible world, at the things that we know, at the things that change, but we're not seeing the things that are happening, that are boiling up and actually are creating maybe the next tsunami. What that means, I'll give you some examples. The first one is very clear. Above the waterline, we're looking at China's decoupling. We're looking at the tensions, we're looking at competition and challenges between the US and China. We're looking at exports of China being affected and basically going to other countries, or the demand going down. This is all about China going down. This is the visible world. What we're not seeing is that most companies in China that have been very successful so far, I'm talking about the Fortune 500 companies in the world, most of them being very successful in China, are now doubling down on the country because they're seeing this huge consumer market. China is the second biggest economy in the world and they've been making lots of money, so why not invest more? If you look at Germany, Volkswagen, BASF, Bayer, they're all investing more. And then you see BMW moving its factory from the UK to China back. You're also seeing countries like Germany starting to double down, or the European Airbus getting lots of orders and Boeing getting no orders right now because it's geopolitical. But the reality, those that feel that there's actually opportunity, and there is, they're doubling down. And then you have the whole Southern Hemisphere. Most of the emerging countries in the world are doing more trade with China than ever before. And so we should look below the waterline and look at those that are reinvesting or investing more, and not just those that are pulling out, because that only gives one side of the story. And maybe those pulling out are maybe the companies that are not so successful or are under enormous pressure geopolitically. And that is maybe not the right decision from an economic point of view. If you just look from the future, next year, according to the IMF, China will still contribute 30% of the global growth in GDP. So yes, if you want growth somewhere, you need to get it either in China or maybe outside of the West, because in the West, you're not going to get more than 10% of growth anywhere in total. And so you need to get the other 90% from other countries. And China is 1/3 of that. Now, if you think about the second thing, the story we've been hearing for 2 years, and specifically last year, about this crackdowns, the new regulation, basically Beijing trying to contain all the tech entrepreneurs, contain the big tech companies, as well as the rich and successful and excesses and so on. This was a story of control. And so we believe that innovation will be hurt. But actually the opposite is happening. More and more entrepreneurs feel that innovation is now, there's room to breathe, because these monopolies are actually put under regulation or under certain rules that they didn't have before. At the same time, we're forgetting to look at the uplifting of China, which is the opportunity for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. What we're seeing is that Xi Jinping, with his common prosperity, is trying to get tens and hundreds of millions of poor people still into the middle class. And this will create new markets, new opportunities, specifically in industries like healthcare, agriculture, in finance, maybe other industries like education even. And so you see that this is a change that is positive, but somehow we prefer the story in the West that it's a negative one. And then the middle class itself is getting uplifted in a world 2.0, call it a metaverse, or call it a new China, which is the invisible China that is making everything faster, more accessible and easier to live in. And this is about this invisible world that is digital, not physical. And so this is something completely new. And if you look at that market, I believe there's huge opportunities. And I would not be surprised that China's taking a lead into the metaverse. I'll talk about that in one of my future videos. Now, the other story has to do with the influence. And specifically in Europe, in the US, we're constantly talking about this political influence through the Belt and Road, and they're buying up our harbors, and they're buying up real estate, and they're actually trying to influence countries to get a foothold. They're going into the mining everywhere in the world, and people are talking about the colonization of Africa from China and so on. And this is a story we hear very often. A physical world being controlled from China. And so our conclusion of that is that China is there to become the next America or hegemony in the world. But if you've lived in China, you know China, what you know is that they really value physical infrastructure because that allows them to create business and economy. And so what we're not seeing below the waterline is the influx of potential companies, entrepreneurs and businesses now wanting to go out of China. Specifically, I think Europe will be incredibly overwhelmed with a tsunami of technology and high tech coming from China in the years to come. It started with electrical vehicles and many other products, but now we're going to see that next phase popping up where it's going to be hard to start competing with Chinese products. Not because we can't, it's just the Chinese have built a different ecosystem and supply chain and made it a lot cheaper for the exact same or better quality. And so this is a new influx of products and services coming to Europe. I think America will be left behind a little bit there because it has become geopolitical too difficult. But this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this doubling down of the Chinese now towards the rest of the world. Specifically because these people know very well that there's a winter, a harsh winter coming up for them in China and globally. And so Europe is maybe the place that can still make money for a couple of years until the spring of China pops up again. Now, this all means that, in my view, what we've been doing in the West, and specifically in America and Europe, is try to protect us from this water that we see, so above the waterline, to actually make sure that this Chinese tsunami is not going into our markets. But that is really hard to do because there's so many cracks into that dam. On top of that, where you should look at, in my view, is how the Chinese, and specifically the countries in the southern hemisphere, you remember all these countries in gray, how they are looking to build bridges, not dams, towards China to integrate closer to China, and by this creating a win-win environment which will actually give fuel to both China and these countries. And so we might miss the bridge if we're only looking at the dam. Now, I think, as a Westerner, what we've been doing for the past many years, maybe 100 years, but definitely these past decades, is to try and get the best place on the beach. We've been having the best place on the beach because we want to be the first in the water. And we've gotten license and patents and everything we have to keep our seat on the beach. We've made sure that we have a right to that seat, to that chair. And maybe when we have a crisis like a pandemic or a war or anything that's happening now, we're reshuffling a little bit the seats, but we still want to be at the seaside. The problem with that, when there's a tsunami coming towards you, wherever it is, I mean, being the first at the beach is not a good idea. It's actually a really bad idea. So this is not a strategy that we should think about. We should actually think differently when it comes to China. And this is not just about China. Crises are coming to us every single year almost. And so we cannot just leave the beach and say we don't care about it because that won't solve our solutions, our problems. The only thing we can do to actually learn what the future will entail is actually to learn to surf the waves. We have to learn to become more agile and try to understand what the waves of the world are, what the waves of China are, and then try to get the best waves, catch the best waves, so we can catch the opportunities when they come. Just sitting at the beach makes no sense. Leaving the beach is completely stupid. So the only thing we can do is to try and learn to surf the waves. And we can only do that by keeping China on our radar and understanding that China is part of a future that is multipolar, that is all about change, and change will never stop, and you need to surf these waves to actually know exactly which wave to catch. You need to understand, in my view, or we need to understand, in my view, that China is cyclical. It's not going down, it's not going up, it's just cyclically, but the trend is definitely going to keep up. And that is why China will be back. It's also about the invisible world, and it's about making sure you can expect the unexpected, both the good and the bad. And that means that you learn to surf. And this is the reason why I believe we need to keep China on our radar. Because if we are not keeping China on our radar, the problem that I expect is that we will not be ready when China is back.